Hello and welcome to this fifth video in our lecture on access control policies and mechanisms. Remember that we're still discussing the kind of access control policy called discretionary access control, DAC, and the general concept invented in around 1970 in this context is that of an access control matrix, which is a two-dimensional tables with the subject on the rows and the object on the columns. And then since this table is extremely sparse in general, two typical approaches that were used to implement the access control matrix are the ACL approach and the capability list approach. So these two approaches basically consist in breaking down the matrix into either rows or columns. So for the ACL approach, we would break down the table into columns, according to which there would be a list, an access control list, that would represent a column. That means it would be indexed by object or by resource, and then would only contain an entry in this linked list if the particular subject would have access to that resource. And then on the flip side, we had the capability list, which would break down the matrix into rows, and that means that every C list would be indexed by a subject and would contain all of the access rights of that particular subject. So it would only contain an entry for the resources that that subject had an access right to. Now, we saw in the previous video the downside of both of these approaches, which is that some of the queries would be extremely inefficient because of the way that the matrix was broken down into either rows or columns. So these approaches were used quite a bit. In particular, the ACL approach has been used in Unix and Linux since the early 70s. But notice that much more recently, in the early 1990s, a researcher proposed a different way of implementing this access control matrix. That's called an authorization table. So this is much closer to what we saw earlier in a picture where we have an authorization database that would be used by the authorization function of the security system. And what an authorization table is basically a table in a regular relational database. So there is a picture here for such a table. And notice in this table, there are three columns or three fields: the subject field, the object field, and then the access mode. And this is basically the access right. So these are the three concepts that we'll be talking about in this lecture. And so basically what this means is that in this table, there is an entry for each combination of a subject and an object, as long as that subject has some access right to the object. So another way to say this is that starting from the access control matrix, remember that these are the subjects, these are the objects, and every entry means that this particular subject has this particular access right to this object. But let's say that the system is very sparse, which is typically the case, because remember, you usually have millions and billions of files and only a very small number of users have access to them. So these empty entries, again, are problematic. So the way that this third and last approach takes care of that is to basically create a database table where every record corresponds to one of these non-empty entries. So for example, this first row could be subject A being the owner of object O1 or file 1. Now notice if there were three access rights in this entry in the access control matrix, there would actually be three different records in the database. And this is because remember that the second column, the second field in this table is an access right or an access mode. So there's a different entry for every type of access right, being the owner or being able to read it or being able to write it or being able to delete it or to search it. This is the possible values for the second column. So what is the advantage of such an approach called an authorization table? Well, there's a very nice feature of this table is that like any database table, it can be indexed, first of all, according to different fields, and second, it can be sorted very quickly. So in particular, notice that if we were to sort this table by the subject field, we would basically get, just as is shown right here, we would get all of the entries, all the records for subject A together, and then all of the um, entries for subject B together, and so on and so forth. So you can think of this section right here as a very compact and very easy to access implementation of a capability list. Why? Because now if you want to know the capabilities, right, or the access right of user A, you would do such a sort operation, and then you would access all of these records just by doing a search on the name or the ID of the subject. On the other hand, if you were to sort this table by this field, by this field in the table by object, you would get basically a list of these records ordered or such that all of the records pertaining to a given file would be grouped together. And so that's not the case right here because we have file one, spread out everywhere. But if we did a sort by the object field, we would basically get the equivalent of an ACL. All of the records corresponding to one resource would be grouped together. So in short, this idea of a authorization table is to use a relational database structure to have no empty entries whatsoever. Notice we're not wasting any space for any of these empty entries in the access control matrix. And at the same time, we have kind of both of the advantages of an ACL and a C or capability list approach. So again, this was proposed in the early 90s, and this is just another example of a way to implement an access control matrix, which is kind of the best of both worlds, uh, where the both worlds are the ACL and the C list approaches.